Good day to you all, and herzlich willkommen to the Botstiber Podcast. This podcast brings together some of the most influential historians, politicians, and more from across the United States and former lands of the Habsburg Empire to discuss the incredible people and events that connect them. My name is Luke Morgante, and for today's episode, we are joined by Dr. Dominique Reil, a professor at the University of Miami, expert in Southern European history, and current grantee of the Botstiber Institute. For years, Dr. Reil has studied the rich histories of European countries in and around the Adriatic coast, many of which were once part of the Habsburg Empire. In 2022, she released her second book, The Fiume Crisis: Life in the Wake of the Habsburg Empire, centering on the troubled multinational city of Fiume in the years following World War I. Known today as the Croatian port city of Rijeka, Fiume has often been referenced in history books as a key location for the rise of Italian fascism. This notion stems from the turbulent years of 1918 to 1921, when the small but quickly growing city was thrust into the fray of great power politics following a descent into sovereignty limbo. Without further ado, welcome Dr. Reil. How are you? How's the weather in Miami?
The weather in Miami is very consistently always hot. So it's one of our most boring questions, but it always makes us feel like we know we have some control.
So you were born in Los Angeles.
Yes.
But you've spent time living in Southern Europe, and you're a university professor now in Miami.
Yes.
Out of all those locations, which has the nicest weather?
Well, definitely not here. No, I love the Mediterranean, so I'll just say any of the Mediterranean places, and California likes to pretend it's Mediterranean too. So I like it where we have some seasons, but I don't have to risk frostbite.
So how did you start getting into Southern Europe in general? How do you go from being a West Coaster of the United States to an expert in Southern European history?
Unfortunately, I am a cliche. I rebelled against my parents in a very non-rebellious way. My mother loved France and my father loved Germany. I was such a Europhile. I'd grown up a large chunk of my life in Germany as a kid, that when I went to college, I just knew I wanted to go abroad, but I knew I didn't want to go anywhere that my parents went. So I signed up for Italian, and I went on a year abroad in Bologna my junior year, and it was during the Yugoslav civil wars. And I hope everybody out there knows what a wonderful experience it is to live in a new world that you don't know very much about, and also learn about the world in those different lenses. And I think that's when I got hooked. And when I went to graduate school, I thought I would be studying Italy, and I really like learning languages, and so I started studying Serbo-Croatian my first year, and just fell in love with learning about all these different worlds I knew so little about. And then I took courses with this very, very famous historian, István Deák, who he's a snake charmer. I've yet to meet a person who's not been in a classroom with him who hasn't changed their field in order to study Central Europe. So I kind of followed the tides, and that's what's brought me here.
Do you feel as if, because of all the time you've spent in those areas now, one country or the region in general feels like a second home to you?
I definitely don't think a country does. If anything, I think a region does. So that was a really great way to ask the question. But yes, I feel every day things change. It's not as if there's any stability anywhere anymore, especially not in Southern Europe. But yes, I do know how to go grocery shopping. And it's reassuring to know how to go grocery shopping. So,
that's step one. When I was first in Germany, one of the things that threw me off the most was when I first went to the Edeka grocery store. Yeah. And the old lady behind me got really, really mad because it took me about 5 minutes to do my groceries.
Yeah.
I didn't have bags ready or anything.
Don't screw around with German shoppers.
So was it early on that Fiume began to spark your interest, or was it something that you kind of got into as you were planning out a research project?
No, this book is really different than my first book. My first book was on mostly around Dalmatia and Trieste and Venice, and it was a book of love. I learned about this whole new world that had been, somehow erased from the history, and I worked so hard to put it back together. And I got very lucky. I had a wonderful editor at Stanford University Press who believed in the project. However, they made it very clear to me that they were not going to be giving me many images because they said, this is a great book, but it's never going to make any money. No one's going to read this. And it made me so sad because I was like, well, that's why we need pictures. Because no one, and they said, if you want pictures, you need to write books about things people care about. And the day I signed my contract, I just made a list of things people care about that piss me off. And D'Annunzio, the guy we're going to be talking about, I'm sure, very soon, is one of these charismatic figures in the history of 20th century Europe who kind of, I kind of think he brainwashed not just his contemporaries, but also us, the readers, into wanting to learn more about him. And Fiume is part of that story. And so that's how I came up with a project. It was a story that never made much sense to me, but it wasn't one that I really cared that much about either. It was about, why is this still here? It didn't make sense to me why this history has remained so stable. Usually historians always like to undo things and make something new. And for some reason, this history has kind of had a lot of legs for something that didn't make much sense. So that's how it was born. It was born actually out of, I want pictures. But in the end, obviously I'm incapable of writing a simple book. And so then this book became something very different.
It's a topic that, as you discuss multiple times throughout the book, it's very well known among political scientists, historians, and different academics, but it's maybe a bit less known even to modern Italians or people from the region or Americans today that at the time played a really big role in shaping the future of Fiume. Could you kind of explain how the crisis came to be and what Fiume's origins were?
Yeah, really quickly though, Italians do know about D'Annunzio. So in Italy today, if you go to school there as a kid, you have to memorize poems by him and you hear all the stories about him and you have heard of the word Fiume. You don't know anything about the town, but you have heard the word and you have heard the story about D'Annunzio. It's kind of like Teddy Roosevelt, and it's a story that Italians do know. They don't know anything about the town, but they do know about D'Annunzio and Fiume. But how it happened is this is a town that was the 8th largest continental port in Europe at the beginning of World War I. And it was in the Habsburg Empire in the Hungarian half. And at the end of World War I, the empire dissolved pretty quickly. No one really knew what was going to happen. And this port was kind of left up for grabs. It wasn't an estate. It was a multilingual, multi-ethnic town. And it had functioned kind of like a Hong Kong of the Habsburg Empire. They had created an administrative unit for it so that it wasn't related to administratively with any of its hinterland. So a town like that and a port like that in a time of economic crisis after World War I, making new states out of empires, it was a goodie that no one could decide who to give it to. And it became this huge bone of contention at the Paris peace treaties. The Italian state wanted it because a large chunk of the population identified as Italian, and many activists in the town wanted the town to be linked to Italy. However, many people also didn't want it linked to Italy from the town and in international circles. And so it became this kind of double war, diplomatic war around the idea of identity. What is the identity of the town and what nation should it be attached to? And then around the idea of economics and politics and global systems, where people like Woodrow Wilson, who really didn't know very much about the Balkans or the Mediterranean, really did know that he didn't like the idea of Italy having a monopoly over the Adriatic Sea. And so the idea of giving this very important port to Italy, as well as many of the other ports, was something Wilson didn't want. And so he very famously at the Paris Peace Conferences said, "Not over my dead body is Italy getting this town." And it turned into this crazy 2-year-long stalemate between the United States, Italy, what will be Yugoslavia. And then this crazy poet shows up. I can't even explain it all in one, but
it's an incredible story. Every time you think that something's going to resolve, another figure pops up.
Yeah, you start off and you just tell this very diplomatic history around the war, and then there's new states, and then there's state interests, and then there's nations, and then you have to get to this like womanizing drug addict poet guy with his followers jumping into the story. And that is why this story, A, has been very hard to tell in a reasoned manner, and B, why it's been a story people like to tell in a reasoned manner, because diplomatic history and economic history can get pretty boring. It also can get pretty hard to decide what's the most important story. How do you not talk about the making of Poland, or what's going to happen to the Ottoman Empire, or what's going to happen to all the German colonies in Africa, or what's going to happen to Germany? There's so many big stories, diplomatic and economic stories to tell at the Paris Peace Conference. If you look at any of these books around 1919, I've spent years of my life reading this stuff, I get lost because it's hard to decide what's the most important thing. Enter Fiume, obviously not the most important place, but important at the time. And then there's this crazy guy, the poet guy, which really differentiates the story from the others. So I'm sure you're going to ask me about the poet guy. So
Yeah.
But just to say, it's a history that pops up in different stories. It pops up in diplomatic history, 1919 Paris, pops up in the idea of nation and Italy and what will be fascism and making a strong state. And it pops up in this idea of the springtime of the peoples and the Balkans and Yugoslavia, before we even get to the weird part of the story.
It's incredible, and you've brought up Gabriele D'Annunzio a few times now, and for those that aren't aware of who he is, I'm sure he sounds like quite the individual at the moment. But could you kind of explain how this city that was a part of the Hungarian section of the Habsburg Empire, and then following World War I was thrust into this kind of no man's land where they had to govern themselves while the great powers decided what would happen to them. During that process, how can a famous poet, celebrity from Italy, basically commandeer power and control of the city's administration?
Well, I mean, this is why people love history, is nothing is necessarily follows the rules. And that is part of what this makes this story so fascinating, is that there's rules that we have about how history works and how states work and how economies work. And then there's a town of 50,000 people that decides it's going to determine the future of state building in Europe. That doesn't make sense. That's not how it's supposed to go. A city should not be telling the United States how to organize the Paris Peace Treaties. That's weird. Another weird thing that happens is there's a stalemate, as I mentioned before, between the United States, Italy, and what is going to become Yugoslavia. And it's kind of at an impasse, and things are boiling up. People are getting frustrated. The troops, there's an inter-allied commission, kind of like after World War II in Vienna and Berlin, where they, these images from the third man. of the Russian and American and British and French troops. After World War I, that's actually happening in Fiume too. There are no Russian troops, obviously the Bolshevik Revolution, but there are British, American, French, Italian troops in this town to trying to keep the town up for grabs, so that no one can come in and take it and say, this isn't a fait accompli, Fiume is going to be mine. Well, you know what? You have to have troops willing to fight. And what happens is D'Annunzio, he was a member, he had volunteered for the Italian military and kind of become this GI Joe for the Italian war effort, decided, you know what, let's just go take it. And so without any government approval or explicit support, he and about 200 followers, mostly veterans, or current soldiers, just walked to the town and said, either shoot us or leave. And the Inter-Allied troops left. So a guy with 200 other guys basically kicked out British, American, French, and Italian troops and took over the town because no one was willing to go to war just a year after the end of World War I over this town. So this turned into a almost 2-year-long occupation of the city by this poet until finally the Italian state decided to bomb the town to force the poet out so that international diplomats could decide the future of the town instead of the poet.
The year prior to D'Annunzio taking over, which I believe is 1919, that is when the city of Fiume first found itself in its precarious situation. And at the time, the administration was taken over by kind of a ragtag group of individuals that had proceeded from the local government prior to the breakup. Why did D'Annunzio, who was fighting kind of under the banner of Italian nationalism, feel the need to usurp the Italian National Council, who was serving as the government at the time?
Initially, so when he gets there in September 1919, he doesn't take over the government. He just kicks out the Inter-Allied troops and takes over their role of Inter-Allied troops. So he kind of takes over just the military role of the city, and the city keeps on running itself. As time goes on and things get tougher, I mean, he thought you show up, you show the world that these stuffed shirts in Paris don't actually have any bite to their bark, and then everyone just gives Fiume to Italy and we all move on. Boom, bada bing. And that doesn't happen. They decide international diplomats decide to not get bullied by him. And so it turns into this waiting game that means that this town is outside of international systems for almost 2 years, which you can imagine creates a situation where there's no trade, there's no money, this is a town, not a country, there's no food. And D'Annunzio is stuck in a situation where, while at the beginning he was very popular, his arrival in Fiume, it just was otherworldly. And with every week he stayed, every week he became more worldly, more, hey guy, you're supposed to be our savior. This is a nightmare. And so after a year, he gets so frustrated with Fiumians, with the locals of the town for not being more supportive of his grand initiative, that he kicks out the government and takes over and creates his own kind of regency, calling it a regency in the name of the Kingdom of Italy, that he's just keeping it until Italy will claim it. And he names himself the Duce. If anyone knows anything about Italian fascism, they probably recognize that word, like what Mussolini called himself, the Duce of Fiume, and he creates an authoritarian government, which never really actually is put into practice. It's more on paper than in reality. That the town government actually does continue to run most of everything, but it's more about the time. D'Annunzio did not go to Fiume to take over Fiume. He went to Fiume for Fiume to be the first of things to be taken over by Italy, to grow Italy's empire. And when he gets stuck there, he's stuck becoming a governor, and he's not really interested in government. And so it's just the wear and tear of day after day, week after week, month after month, that pushes him into an administrative role he never wanted and pushes the city government out of ruling.
And one of the interesting things is, despite the heavy correlation with Italian nationalism and that kind of underscoring of all the actions that they were taking and the news coming out of the city directly at the time, there were a lot of Croatian, Serbian, Hungarian, and other individuals that supported the annexation of Fiume to Italy. Why is that?
I mean, there's so many ways to answer that question. First of all, it's a boom town, right? So it grew by 60% in 30 years. People who moved to this town did not move there because of their long-standing cultural ties to the town. People who moved there because they wanted to make money. Either they were looking for a job because they were unemployed, or because they see this growing entrepot, commercial, global capitalist center, and they want in on the action. So the people that were attracted to this town are an amalgamation of peoples from Central Europe, the Balkans, and the Mediterranean. And what you get is this crazy situation where you have about a little less than 50% of the population that is identified as mother tongue Italian. And then you have about over 10% of the population that's identified as mother tongue Hungarian. And then you have about 5% of the population that's identified as mother tongue German, and 5% that's identified as mother tongue Slovene, and about, depending on how you count and who you count, less than 20% that's considered mother tongue Serbo-Croatian. And then you've got all these Czechs and Yiddish speakers, and then it gets out of control. And the reason why it's so mixed up is because it's a port town that's a new port town. So the idea that after the war, all of a sudden everybody's national is kind of crazy, because the reason why people are there is because it's global. And what people want is the reason why they came to the town to continue being what the town is: a town of industry, a town of opportunity, a town of trade. And Italy seems on the go. I mean, they want to build an empire, and they want to control ports, and they want, so let's go. So, there are people who want Italy to take over Fiume because of nationalism, because of ethnicity and language use. There are people who don't want it to take over because of nationalism and ethnicity and language use. And then there are these other people that are really thinking about their rents or their bank accounts or their jobs or their future. It's hard to decide or understand what people are thinking at any moment. But it is true that town was not a nationalist town before World War I, even though it became the kind of figurehead of post-war nationalism afterwards.
And does this tie in to, during the book, you talk about the term Fumanissimo, or like Fumanization, I think it would be in English. How exactly is that term used? And is it connected to this kind of multinational hodgepodge?
The word that you're talking about is a word that's used in Italian, and it's actually more about the D'Annunzio stuff. So it's in Italian historiography, and actually just in Italian school books or in Italian lore. There's even comic books about this. D'Annunzio's arrival in the town is told as kind of Woodstock. I know this sounds crazy, but he and his followers, the poet and his ragtag bunch of artists and bohemians and people on the edge, arrive and come and make a world outside the world. And there are little moments in the story of D'Annunzio and his followers in the town that have pirates and have parties and there's one group that calls itself yoga, and there's nudists. There's all these weird things happening in this time period when D'Annunzio is there. And this word, Fumanissimo, is used to describe this kind of post-war feeling of a new beginning that happens in the town with D'Annunzio. That word is never used to describe people from the town. It's used to describe Italians who kind of have a getaway get away from the drabness of economic depression, war weariness, death, all things constitutional and strikes. There's 2 years of strikes going on in Italy at this time.
It's like in I'm from New Jersey, and there's the people that live on the beach all year round,
right?
And then they refer to the people that only come to the beach during the summer as bennies.
Yeah, and in Miami we call them snowbirds, the people that come in the winter. Yeah, so your bennies or my snowbirds are the Fumissimi. And then the people from the town are living something much less fun.
That was one of the most interesting things that you talked about. I thought was you kind of go into these life stories,
yeah,
little chunks for various individuals that lived in Fiume before and after World War I. Mm-hmm. Were there any that stood out to you specifically?
There's so many. This is a book that I, like so many historians I'm sure you've talked to, I thought I was going to write this book fast and furious, and I started off on a real fast trajectory, and then things happened, and I would think about the stories that really meant something to me while I was slowing down because of family things and administrative stuff and whatever, because they kept me invested in the book. And I remember this one night, my stepfather had just had a stroke. He actually ended up dying, and I had to drive all night long from the archive, D'Annunzio's archive in Italy, to Rome in order to get the first flight back to California. And in order to stay awake, I was telling myself out loud in the car stories that some of them are in the book that reminded me about why this book is about life. And the first one that came to my mind that when you asked that question is actually not in the book right now. It's a woman, it's school teacher. She was from Fiume, and she worked in the city schools, and she spoke Italian, but her mother language was Serbo-Croatian, and she also spoke Hungarian. With all the changes in government, she lost her classroom in the middle of the city center and was sent to some school in the outskirts, which she didn't like. And then with another change in whoever was in charge of the school board, she got sent even further out. And by the story I'm thinking about happens actually after D'Annunzio gets kicked out, and Mussolini takes over the town in 1922. And she writes a letter to the school board begging to reassign her to the city of the center. And she says, if you guys don't let me come back to my town, I'm going to kill myself. I'm going to cut my veins, she says in Italian. And she writes this whole letter, this suicide threat letter about, give me my city center school district, in a pencil that is white, red, and green, the colors of Italy. So in her writing, when you were a kid, you had those pencils that had the multicolors, and when you write, a rainbow would come up.
Yep.
It's such a nationalist pencil. It's a nationalist pencil, and and she's convinced that if she just shows what a good Italian she is, they will let her with her weird Italian pencil. And then she says at the end, "Yay, fascism." But anyways, these stories about these people who go through so many twists and turns from the end of the war until the end of the D'Annunzio period, and are just trying to survive and retell their stories and rearrange their lives in so many different ways in order to lose as little as possible. Just like this teacher getting moved from one school to the next, she'll just finally say, "Long live fascism," just so she can come back home. Those are the stories throughout the book, in one way or the other, that made me write it.
Yeah, as often is the case in history, there's kind of what is put out as being the most important in any given historical situation. Mm-hmm. And then there's always the lived experiences of the people there, which are always in a bit more of a gray area.
Yeah.
Which is seemingly the case for Fiume as well in many regards.
Yeah.
So there were all of these individuals that did choose to stay following the war, and In some cases, it seems like they benefited through the mess that was converting all the different currencies and regulating that system. Some people were trying to update their citizenship and pertinency status. Mm-hmm. And there were also teachers, like you said. I know at one point there was a teacher who chose to not have her students sing Italian nationalist songs, I believe, because they were demeaning to her Slavic background. Mm-hmm. What kinds of changes did Fiume's experience over these 3 years? And kind of what are the discrepancies between what was being reported at the time and what people were actually experiencing?
That's such a good question, and obviously there's no answer for it. The real answer is there is no one answer, and that's what my book is trying to show, is that we have such a stable telling of this time period about what the normal history of Europe after World War I goes a little bit like this. Before World War I, there are empires and there are nation states. There are liberal organized countries. There are socialist movements, and everything is coming to a head. And then with 4 years of devastating war, violence, a kind of a virus of violence and intolerance is let loose that kind of disallows the overlappings of difference the same way as was happening before World War I. And especially in East Central Europe, that was mostly very multi-ethnic and multilingual and multi-religious, the cosmopolitanism of the pre-war is rendered almost impossible with this new vision of states need to be organized around nations, and the only people you can trust are the people of your nation. What my book tries to show is that is not the case. Yes, there is enormous violence in many parts of Europe after World War I. Yes, a lot of this violence is also nationally informed. Yes, a lot of this violence is a hangover from what happened with World War I. But there are just as many stories that are not about violence, and there are just as many stories about people who just want to go back, who just want to keep on living the lives they had before. And those stories have been erased. Those stories don't make sense anymore. They actually seem almost like some kind of like goody-goody two-shoe children's tale. And I find that there's something very dangerous about the idea that people not wanting to kill each other is naive. or people worried about feeding their children is naive. So what my history is, and all these moments, these chapters, one is about money, one is about law, one is about citizenship, one is about education and propaganda and names and flags. All of the book is about showing all these different strategies people use in order to make it by, to make it through, and maybe to come up ahead, as you mentioned. But we have been trained to not see it. And we've been trained to see something that makes Hitler make sense. And you know, maybe it's not a great idea to try and write history to make Hitler make sense, especially almost 20 years before. So that's what the book shows. The book is showing how people wake up in the morning, their world has changed. But that doesn't mean they've changed. And they start changing with the circumstances. They start trying to figure out how to change the circumstances to best fit their needs. And it's very unclear what the final outcome will be. And in fact, Fiume's history has been turned into a myth more than a history, precisely because we wanted the story to be easy.
And one of the most, I guess, surprising things from that story is that this city that considered itself Italian, if nothing else, it was bombed by Italy a few years after one of the deadliest wars.
Yeah.
How can that even be the case?
Well, you know, if there's an international peace settlement with all the most powerful countries in the world deciding that they're going to make the map of the world to make a peace to end all peace, and then you have some weird poet guy with his followers deciding, screw that. At a certain point, it's a game of chicken, and that's what happened. The guys in Paris had decided that they were going to determine what was going to happen to Fiume, and the town under D'Annunzio decided to not pay attention. And eventually, guess what? the international global diplomacy showed the town who's in charge. So although it sounds insane that Italy bombed the town of Fiume to force it to stop calling itself Italian, if you flip it around, it actually is like, well, if you don't eat your Brussels sprouts, you're going to get sent to your room. It is a moment where those bombs and there aren't that many. I mean, honestly, the attack on Fiume was done as carefully as possible to kill as few as people as possible and create as little damage as possible. Mm-hmm. No one wanted that war. What it was to show that there are still teeth in international diplomacy, even though no one wanted to show them. It's a little sad that they were so careful with Fiume and so uncareful with what was happening in the ex-Ottoman lands or what was happening in the colonial lands of Africa. I mean, one can really start asking some other questions about why so much diplomatic care is being put into Fiume and so little diplomatic care was being put into the Middle East, but that's a different story.
And a lot of that stemmed originally from conversations between Woodrow Wilson and the Italian delegation at the conference. Yes. What made Fiume different for Wilson? Why did he choose to kind of pick a fight, if you will? And why is that fight Fiume?
Wilson really didn't respect the Italian government that much, nor he had his own prejudices around Italian cultural mores. He is an American. He was in New Jersey. It is the early 20th century. So there have been historians who I think quite provocatively and justly argue that he had some chauvinism going into this. But also, Italy was a much weaker country than France or Great Britain. And so making claims for imperial expansion is one thing if you're France or Great Britain in the Middle East or in Asia or in Africa. And making those same claims and you're Italy is very different. And so in many ways, Fiume happens precisely because the imperial power most interested in that project is a weak one, and one that Wilson feels he can easily push aside and perhaps look more righteous because of it. There are many hotspot towns throughout Europe and throughout the world that are just papered over. That doesn't happen with Fiume because of the diplomatic situation.
Closer to the beginning, you mentioned how a lot can be gleaned for modern politics, current events from the story of Fiume and what was happening at the time. Mm-hmm. I'm pretty sure you compare D'Annunzio to the ability to understand current figures like Donald Trump, a lot of different people that run on the back of more populist platforms. What do you think are the most important things to be understood today that come from the story of Fiume?
This sounds... I really hope that the listeners can give me just a moment. If a story is too good to be true, it probably isn't true. If something is so entertaining that you can't believe it's news, maybe it's not. What D'Annunzio did is he used his incredible genius. He was an amazing writer. He was a theatrical man. He had a genius for seeing that you can do things even though people don't do them. And people would watch and listen. It was amazing. You felt so alive because none of it was supposed to happen. But that doesn't mean any of it was actually happening, that it was the story and it was the world. It was the world that will entertain you. It was not the world that was why there was an issue in the first place. And so I guess what my book is trying to show that there is so much life that is fascinating and complicated and heartwarming and also, anxiety producing. All the emotions you can want are in life itself. You do not need that guy manipulating us and using yellow journalism to make the world an easy yes or no. And that is what the Fiume crisis was at the moment, is that it was a manipulation of the media by a fascinating, brilliant guy and his followers that erased what was actually happening on the ground. And on the ground was, something that many people, I'm sure, didn't want to live themselves, but it was filled with life, and it had enormous consequences, not just for the people there.
It's a sad story, but it seems like a really important one.
Yeah, I wrote a little thing for this blog for Christmas. I think it was last year or 2 years ago. With the pandemic, it's hard to remember. About, when we hear about this crazy story, we want to understand, why would someone follow D'Annunzio? Why, if you're 18 years old, would you run away from home and leave your girlfriend and go to this world you've never been to, Fiume, who's ever even heard of that place, and follow this poet? Why would you do that? And that's what those are the kind of questions historians have been asking. They've been asking, how did he do it? Why did people follow? Isn't this incredible? And the more we keep on trying to understand the extraordinary, we stop seeing the extraordinary ordinary. And the 50,000 people in that town, and if you count the hinterlands, the 100,000 people, the sailors, the children, the wives, the businessmen, the beggars, the fortune tellers, the prostitutes, the whatevers. All of these crazy stories disappear, and we get that guy and the 17-year-old following him. And I don't know, it feels pretty flat and boring to me.
At any point in your research, did you find yourself rooting for one outcome or another, even though you knew what would ultimately befall the city? Were you in some part of you hoping, oh, maybe D'Annunzio and Fiume will be able to figure it out and be their own city?
That's such a great question. No one's asked me that. And here's the answer. I don't know what the right answer would have been. This was a town that was an imperial town in the true sense of the word, that now needed to be put in a nation state, because that's what was on offer. Was it going to be in Italy, or was it going to be in what was going to be Yugoslavia? And in the end, at the end of this time period of the book, they decide, we can't decide either. And they say, we'll just make it an independent country. Well, that didn't work either. A 50,000 person independent country in the middle between two warring siblings is not going to work. So while I was writing the book, it was really easy to not root for any side, because it didn't look like any side would win. Mm-hmm. In my first book, I was definitely rooting for certain sides. And in this book, I was more like, there's a reason this couldn't be solved. It's still, there's unfortunately, things just got worse. So I know what I wish hadn't happened, but I didn't have this vision of, oh, why won't they just listen to this guy? He knows the answer.
And a big issue with that was, who was the sovereign? Like, where did the sovereignty lie?
Right.
After they were no longer part of the Hungarian portion. And it seems like they carried over some of their laws from Hungary's system, but at the same time, they were trying to adopt the Italian legal code.
Right.
Do you see Fiume between 1918 and 21? Do you think it acted more as a continuation of this state within a layered sovereignty system of the Habsburg Empire? Or do you think it began to act more so with, I think you called it locally centered imperialism?
So, let's imagine it in a different way. If you're in a company or in some kind of institution and you lose your sovereignty, you're put in receivership, right? So you're now going to be organized. You're not something new yet, but you're not organized the way you were. So Fiume is kind of put in this kind of on pause. They don't have a new government. They don't have a new king. They don't have a new president. They don't have a new anything. So they self-declare themselves independent, and they make their city council their provisional government. And they just decide, and they say, they make an issue that everything from before is the same until we say it's different. So they don't say all the laws from before will be our laws. They just say everything is the same until you've been informed of otherwise. And then they kind of pick and choose and add and subtract here and there to make things go better, or to try and hedge their bets in one way or the other. But the time period is a transitional one. And they are organizing themselves precisely in that way. They don't think this is going to last forever. They think that they are just kind of consolidating what they were to face what they are going to be, and to try and, again, be as strong or lose as little as possible in the transition period. So if any of your listeners have been through transition, institutional transition, I'm sure that they can imagine how unpleasant this felt, and it's almost like you're a boat and you're sinking and you're trying to bail out water and figure out where you can patch things up. It is pretty beautiful to watch what they keep. So even though this is a time of incredible nationalism, they are not creating any kind of really chauvinistic evil rules, like all people who aren't Italian are kicked out, or everybody has to speak Italian. They create this kind of facade of the nation and allow diversity to continue under the facade. And I find that very interesting.
Yeah, and I mean, if there was any theme with what we've talked about so far today, it seems to be that there's a lot more nuance, as always, than is ever able to be understood in these stories. And I guess, is there... I'm trying to think about how to phrase it, but with the story of Fiume and how it's gone from this whole period of a few years to what happened before and after, and now it is this one of the larger cities in modern-day Croatia. It's gone through all these changes. And what is modern Rijeka, as it's called in Croatian? As you say in the book, Rijeka means river in Croatian, Fiume means river in Italian.
And there's no big river.
Yeah, and it's a small river.
The river's so small that its name is Little River.
The nuance never ends.
But what is it like today? It's a really mind-boggling place. So it after this time period of the book, it was a independent city-state, depending on how you want to count it, for about 4 years. And then when after Mussolini took over the Italian state a couple of years later, he annexed the town. So it was forcibly taken by the Italian state with the support of local fascists in Fiume at the time. From 1924 until 1944, more or less, it was a functioning part of the Italian fascist empire. And it was no longer a facade of nationalism under a lived reality of diversity management. It was a fascist nationalist government that was about Italianizing and expelling those who should not be part of the Italian nation. When the Italian fascist government lost, and then the Nazis came, and then when the Nazis lost, the Yugoslav socialist government took over the town. And there was a wild spree of vendetta, a revenge against people who had been leading this Italian fascist world. There was also a fear of vendetta. And so there was an enormous expulsion, voluntary or involuntary. There's a lot of argument about this. Almost half of the town left and went to Italy. This then became a showcase for Tito's Yugoslavia, of showing that Yugoslavia can make Rijeka, the new town, whole again and modern. And so an enormous amount of money was pumped into the town to turn it back into this vibrant port city of Tito's new Yugoslav socialist state. And the multinationalism of Yugoslavia was one of the strong currents of this remaking of Rijeka. People from all over Yugoslavia were encouraged to move to Rijeka, and so it actually got another wave of new cultures and diversities and language practices with this new Yugoslavia. And in the 1950s and 1960s, the city had been bombed at the end of World War II. It was a huge rebuilding program, a huge reinvestment in ships and shipbuilding and infrastructure. By the 1970s, Rijeka was like the happening place. There's a underground music scene. It was doing pretty well.
Not the same Woodstock, but
No,
still.
no, it was, and then it got Detroit. And then, in the 80s, Yugoslavia is not doing great. Shipping is not doing great. These infrastructures are getting old. And with the fall of the wall, the economic disaster that happens to Yugoslavia happens big time to Rijeka as well. When the Yugoslav civil wars happen, Rijeka is not really actually very in that war. And it is considered not by many nationalist parties a kind of traitor, because it wasn't directly in the war the way many parts of Croatia were, and it just wasn't one of the havens of Croatian nationalist movement, although there's a strong nationalist movement there as well. Today there's two visions of Rijeka. Rijeka as a European city, as a city built on diversity, as a city built on a crossroads of Europe and the Mediterranean. It was a city of culture for the EU, obviously with its bad luck right when the pandemic started. And so there's a cultural movement in the town that is very outspoken about being open-minded and open thinking, and that this is what Rijeka has always been about. And then there's another version of this, which is very nationalist, anti-Italian. That is about Rijeka was always at war with this other thing, Fiume, and the real city is Rijeka. And it's very unclear to me what's going to happen in the future. And again, because of the pandemic, and also I've moved on to another project, I'm not in the town as much as I was. So what I'm saying, I'm sure every day is changing, and the pandemic has changed things enormously. But if people get a chance to go visit, it is definitely a town which is just as confusing as my book, and hopefully just as fun.
There's it looks beautiful as well for anyone listening that's thinking about going to the Adriatic coast. It's definitely not a bad decision.
No, it's like Berlin. A friend of mine I grew up in Berlin as a kid, and one of my best friends, she's from Berlin. She's like, I love it. It reminds me of Berlin in the 80s, except with islands and beautiful sunsets over the water and excellent fish.
So with that kind of dual mindset that you've observed today, where it's on one hand kind of an upheaval from the period of Italian fascism, and when the people were kind of forced to accept that narrative, there's the upheaval against that, but there's also this sense of openness and finding a better way forward. Do you think that any of those sentiments still come from 1918 to 21? Or do you think that so much has already happened that the story of Fiumeans at the time isn't as relevant to the people of Rijeka today?
That's so interesting. I never know how to answer these questions, and so I always change my answers. So I'm going to give this answer. Maybe the next time we talk, I'll change it again. But I think that human beings they get inspiration from what they think is possible. And so thinking about the past and thinking about Fiume Rijeka as a multicultural, multi-ethnic space filled with peoples of different interests and different backgrounds and religious beliefs and everything living and struggling together, makes you feel like, hey, maybe this is a town where that's possible. And so it starts becoming a forerunner for the future. And then when you're in a mood of thinking, gosh, all of this cacophony of interests and languages and cultures is why things don't work, then you can think of the moments in the history of this town where it's the opposite. And that's when the trains ran on time. And so right now I feel like the city is trying to decide which past is the more usable one for the future. But I do think in the architecture of the city, in the structure of the city, you feel that this is a world of many cultures. There is an archaeological whiff in a very modern sense, where you feel it's Hungarian, where you feel it's Croatian, where you feel it's Italian, where you feel it's German, where you feel it's Jewish. where you feel it's Roman. There's still some Roman ruins there, and so there's enough there that you cannot forget that it never was a simple place, and there's a lot of room to be a complicated one.
That's a beautiful way to summarize it, I think, in the end. So I just want to say thank you so much for agreeing to do the podcast. For those listening, if you would like to learn more about this crazy city of Fiume at the time and what it was like to be there, then you can get Dr. Reill's book, The Fiume Crisis, Life in the Wake of the Habsburg Empire. Is there anything else you wanted to say before we go about Fiume? I know that you're also working on another project right now for the Botstiber Institute for your third book.
Well, I'm just happy that Botstiber was interested in talking about Fiume. I hope your listeners think about your project and your mission in as broad a ways as including my work in your program is, which is that Fiume's story is a Central European story. It is a Habsburg story. It is, even though you're going to get excellent Branzino and wonderful white wine when you go visit Rijeka and you sit and look at the sunset over the harbor, which is very different than going to Salzburg, it is still connected. And I really love your guys' organization because I think that it's just so useful to put all of these different research projects and questions and cultural monuments together to really see them as a whole. So I'm really grateful that you invited me to come talk about this project, especially because it is about Botstiber.
Of course. I loved the book.
Go on.
I'm looking forward to talking more in the future.
Okay, great. Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all for listening to today's episode. If you enjoyed the podcast, keep an eye out for new content across our various social media platforms. The Botstiber Institute for Austrian-American Studies promotes an understanding of the historic relationship between the United States and Austria, including lands of the former Habsburg Empire, by awarding grants and fellowships, organizing lectures and conferences, and publishing the Journal of Austrian-American History. We engage with a broader public audience through digital programming, including videos, podcasts, and blog posts. Auf Wiedersehen, and see you next time.